At 6 a.m., Boston was waking up like any other American city. People were heading to work. Coffee shops were opening. Police officers were preparing for another ordinary day. And along Boylston Street, the final preparations for one of America's biggest sporting events were already underway. Nobody knew that before the day was over. This city would become the center of one of the largest manhunts in modern American history. And nobody knew that the people responsible were still somewhere inside the city. They were watching, waiting, and preparing to disappear. This is the story of the Boston Marathon bombing, a story that began with 2 explosions and ended with an entire city locked down. But the explosions were only the beginning, because what happened next would transform Boston into a massive crime scene in force. Thousands of law enforcement, officers into a desperate search for 2 suspects. April 15, 2013, Boston, Massachusetts. The Boston Marathon is underway. For more than a century, the marathon has represented endurance, tradition, and American resilience. Hundreds of thousands of spectators crowd the streets. Families stand behind barriers. Children wave flags. Runners push themselves toward the finish line. And then, at approximately 2:49 in the afternoon, everything changes. A blast tears through the crowd near the marathon's finish line. People are thrown to the ground. Glass shatters. Smoke fills the street. For a few seconds, nobody understands what has happened. Then another explosion follows. The celebration becomes chaos. The finish line becomes a crime scene. And the streets that were filled with cheering spectators are suddenly filled with police officers, firefighters, paramedics, and terrified civilians. But the real mystery is just beginning. Who did this? And why? The FBI quickly takes a leading role in the investigation. The crime scene is enormous. Investigators begin collecting fragments. They photograph damaged buildings. They examine surveillance footage. They search through thousands of pieces of evidence. And then they find something that changes the investigation. Cameras. Boston was covered with them. Security cameras. Businesses. Hotels. Private surveillance systems. Investigators begin reconstructing the final minutes before the explosions. Frame by frame. Person by person. Bag by bag. And eventually, investigators identify 2 men. 2 brothers. Tamerlan Tsarnaev and Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. But identifying them is only half the problem. They still have to find them, and the suspects have already started moving. This is where the story becomes even more dangerous, because investigators are no longer searching for people connected to a bombing. They are searching for armed suspects who may be willing to kill again. The city doesn't know it yet, but a second attack is coming. Just days after the marathon bombing, Boston is preparing for another night. But shortly after midnight on April 19th, police officers encounter the brothers in Watertown. Gunfire erupts. 1 officer is shot. Explosions are heard. Residents wake up to the sound of gunfire in their neighborhoods. What had started 4 days earlier as a bombing investigation has now become an armed confrontation. And one of the suspects is killed. Tamerlan Tsarnaev is down, but Dzhokhar is gone. And that creates a terrifying new problem. The younger brother has disappeared into a densely populated American neighborhood. Somewhere nearby, a wounded suspect is hiding. Nobody knows exactly where. And investigators have to find him before he can escape. This is where the FBI manhunt reaches its most intense phase. Authorities establish a massive perimeter around Watertown. Tactical teams move through the streets. Armored vehicles arrive. Helicopters circle overhead. Police search houses. Residents are ordered to remain indoors. Businesses close. Public transportation is disrupted. Boston effectively freezes. Millions of Americans watch the unfolding operation on television. For the people inside the search zone, however, this isn't television. It is happening outside their front doors. The streets are empty. Police vehicles occupy intersections. Tactical officers move from house to house. And behind every closed door is the same question. Is he here? The scale of the operation is enormous. Federal agents, local police, state police, SWAT teams, emergency responders, hundreds of officers begin searching for 1 man. But the suspect has something the authorities don't have: time and a place to hide. Watertown is not an empty battlefield. It is a normal American neighborhood. Houses, backyards, garages, driveways, cars, thousands of possible hiding places. Every minute matters, because if the suspect escapes the perimeter, the search becomes dramatically harder. The FBI and local authorities therefore face a simple but brutal equation. Move too slowly, and he disappears. Move too aggressively, and innocent civilians could be caught in the middle. But the system has already made one critical discovery. The suspect is not simply running. He is wounded, and that changes everything. Meanwhile, the entire country is watching. News helicopters hover above the neighborhood. Television networks broadcast live updates. Social media fills with rumors. Some reports are accurate, others are not. The investigation becomes one of the largest breaking news stories in America. But inside the command centers, investigators have a different priority. Evidence. They need facts, not rumors, not speculation. Facts. Who saw the suspects? Where did they go? What vehicle did they use? What buildings did they approach? What evidence connects them to the bombing? Every camera becomes a potential witness. Every piece of debris becomes a potential clue. Every phone call could matter. And somewhere in Watertown, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev is hiding. The manhunt continues. Then, something unexpected happens. A resident notices something unusual near a boat stored in his backyard. He looks closer and sees a person hiding inside. The police are called. The area is secured. Officers surround the boat. And suddenly, the search that had consumed an entire city reaches its final moment. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev is still alive. The suspect who investigators had been searching for is finally located. He is taken into custody. The manhunt is over, but the investigation is not even close, because catching the suspect answers one question. It does not answer all of them. Investigators now have to reconstruct what happened before the bombing. They examine the brothers' backgrounds, their movements, their communications, their connections, their motivations, and the evidence gathered during the investigation becomes central to the prosecution. The case eventually moves into the American federal court system. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev is charged with numerous federal offenses related to the bombing and subsequent violence. The trial becomes another chapter in a story that has already changed. Boston forever. But perhaps the most important part of the story is not the courtroom. It is what happened to the city itself. Before April 15th, Boylston Street was associated with celebration, with running, with cheering crowds, with the finish line. After April 15th, it became associated with something else. Fear. For a brief period, an ordinary American city experienced something extraordinary. A major public event had been attacked. Police officers had been targeted. A suspect had engaged law enforcement in a violent confrontation, and thousands of residents had been told to stay inside while heavily armed officers searched their neighborhoods. The images were unlike anything most Americans had seen in years. Armored vehicles on residential streets, tactical teams moving between houses, helicopters above rooftops, empty streets, closed businesses, a city waiting for an answer. But there is another side to the story. The victims, the runners, the spectators, the first responders, the medical workers, the ordinary people who ran toward danger when everyone else was trying to escape. Their stories became part of the identity of Boston. The bombing was designed to create fear. Instead, it produced another response: defiance. People returned. The marathon continued. The finish line remained. And the city refused to let violence define it. That is what makes the Boston Manhunt more than a story about two suspects. It is a story about how a modern American city responds when the impossible happens. It shows the power of surveillance, the importance of forensic evidence, the coordination between local and federal law enforcement, and the extraordinary difficulty of finding one person inside a crowded city. But it also exposes the fragility of everyday life. One moment, thousands of people are watching a race. The next, sirens fill the streets. The cameras begin recording. Investigators start collecting evidence. And an entire city waits for someone to be found. The final capture lasted only moments. But the investigation behind it involves thousands of people, countless pieces of evidence, and an enormous law enforcement response. And perhaps that is the most unsettling lesson. Modern cities are full of cameras, full of technology, full of systems designed to keep people safe. Yet when violence happens, those systems still depend on human beings to interpret the evidence, make decisions, and act under pressure. The Boston Marathon bombing lasted only minutes. The manhunt lasted days. But the consequences lasted far longer. Lives were changed. Families were destroyed. A city was wounded. And an entire country was. Reminded that even the most familiar places can become the center of a national crisis without warning. The streets eventually reopened. The crowds returned. The barricades disappeared. The cameras stopped broadcasting. And Boston began the long process of moving forward. But the memory remained. Because April 15th, 2013 was not simply the day 2 bombs exploded near a marathon finish line. It was the day an ordinary American celebration became a crime scene. The day an investigation became a manhunt. And the day an entire city learned what it feels like to wait while danger is hiding somewhere nearby. The explosions lasted seconds. The search lasted days. But the question they left behind has lasted much longer. How prepared are we when the ordinary suddenly becomes extraordinary? And when the next crisis begins, will we recognize it before it is too late? Because sometimes the most dangerous moment is not when the first explosion happens. It is the moment afterward, when nobody yet knows what comes next. The city is silent. The investigators are searching. The cameras are recording. And somewhere nearby, the suspect is still hiding. Thousands of officers continue moving through the streets. Every house is a possibility. Every vehicle is examined. Every piece of information is checked. The search becomes a race against time. Inside the FBI command center, investigators continue connecting the evidence. Surveillance footage, witness statements, forensic evidence, movement patterns. Piece by piece, the picture becomes clearer. Outside, Watertown remains almost completely silent. Residents stay inside. Police control the streets. Helicopters patrol overhead. And tactical teams continue their search. Then comes the clue that changes everything. A homeowner notices something unusual in his backyard. A boat. Something about it doesn't look right. He moves closer. For a moment, there is silence. Then he realizes someone may be hiding inside. The homeowner backs away. He calls the police. And within minutes, the neighborhood changes again. Police vehicles begin arriving. Officers establish a perimeter. Tactical teams move into position. The helicopter spotlight illuminates the backyard. The boat becomes the center of the entire operation. Officers approach carefully. They don't know exactly what they are going to find. They don't know whether the suspect is armed, and they don't know how he will react. Inside the boat, the suspect is hiding, wounded, exhausted, and surrounded. Outside, heavily armed officers wait. The operation moves slowly. Officers secure the area. More tactical units arrive. Every movement is deliberate. Every second matters. Then, the suspect is finally brought out. The man investigators had been searching for is no longer hiding. The search is over. Police escort him away from the backyard. News helicopters remain overhead. Officers continue securing the neighborhood. And for the first time in days, Boston can begin to breathe again. But for investigators, the work continues. The arrest is not the end. It is the beginning of the next phase. Now they must understand everything that happened. They examine evidence. They reconstruct movements. They analyze communications. They review surveillance footage. They attempt to understand how the entire operation unfolded. The evidence eventually moves into the courtroom. Lawyers prepare their arguments. Investigators become witnesses. The surviving suspect faces the American justice system. But beyond the courtroom, Boston is still healing. Boylston Street is slowly returning to normal. Businesses reopen. People return. The city begins rebuilding its sense of safety. Flowers appear along the streets. People leave messages. Families remember those who were lost. First responders are recognized for their actions. The marathon route eventually fills with people again. Runners return. Spectators return. The finish line remains. And the city sends a message. It will not disappear. Because the goal of terrorism is not simply destruction. It is fear. It is the belief that ordinary life can never return. But Boston chose something different. It chose to return, to run, to gather, to stand together, and to refuse to allow one terrible day to define an entire city. The Boston Manhunt also demonstrated something important about modern investigations. Technology can help investigators see what happened, but technology alone cannot solve a case. People must interpret the evidence. Agents must connect the clues. Officers must make decisions. And thousands of individuals must coordinate under extreme pressure. That combination of technology and human judgment helped investigators turn a chaotic crime scene into a traceable investigation. Surveillance cameras provided images. Forensic evidence provided physical clues. Witnesses provided information, and law enforcement connected those pieces. What began with 2 explosions eventually became a massive investigation. Then a manhunt. Then a capture. And finally, a courtroom case. But the emotional impact cannot be measured by arrests or evidence. For the victims and their families, the story is personal. For first responders, it is a memory that never simply disappears. For Boston, it became part of the city's history. The streets may look ordinary again. People may walk the same sidewalks. Cars may drive through the same intersections. But places can remember. And Boylston Street remembers. The cameras eventually stop recording. The police vehicles leave. The barricades disappear. The news crews move on. But the lessons remain. The bombing showed how quickly an ordinary public gathering can become a national emergency. It showed the importance of preparation. It showed the value of surveillance. And it showed the importance of coordinated law enforcement. But perhaps most importantly, it showed what happens when ordinary people refuse to surrender to fear. The marathon returned. The crowds returned. Boston returned. The finish line remained exactly where it had always been. And runners continued crossing it. Not because the past had disappeared, but because the city refused to let the past control its future. The Boston Marathon bombing lasted only minutes, but the investigation that followed became one of the most intense manhunts in modern American history. Thousands of officers, countless pieces of evidence, days of searching. And finally, one boat, one backyard, one hidden suspect. That was where the manhunt ended. The explosions lasted seconds. The search lasted days. The trial lasted far longer. But the consequences became part of American history. Boston had been tested. Its streets had been emptied. Its residents had been frightened. Its law enforcement agencies had been pushed to the limit. Yet the city stood again. And perhaps that is the final lesson. When the ordinary suddenly becomes extraordinary, the response matters. The evidence matters. The decisions matter. And sometimes finding one person requires an entire city to stand still. The streets eventually filled again. The marathon returned. The finish line remained. And Boston moved forward. Because the explosions lasted seconds. The manhunt lasted days. But the memory lasted forever.